The rain didn't fall so much as it assaulted the city, a relentless, horizontal barrage that turned windshields into murky cataracts and streets into swirling, black rivers. For Liliana, the storm was a physical manifestation of the exhaustion that clung to her bones. Her shift at the hospital had been a marathon of human suffering, a 16-hour stretch that had ended not with a sense of accomplishment, but with the hollowing dread of the stack of bills waiting on her kitchen table. The old sedan she drove, a creature of coughs and rattles, seemed to share her fatigue, its wipers struggling valiantly against the onslaught as she navigated the familiar, winding road that led away from the city's bright heart and toward its dim, suburban fringe. This was her life, a narrow track between the sterile, fluorescent glare of the hospital and the quiet, crumbling worry of a home that held her brother's fragile health. The world outside her fogged windows was a formless, dark blur, and she was alone in it, a solitary figure in a metal shell moving through a primordial night. Her thoughts were a loop of anxieties: Julian's latest lab results, the ominous final notice from the power company, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. So consumed was she by this internal storm that the figure that stumbled into the road ahead was less a man and more a sudden, violent tear in the fabric of the night. Her foot slammed the brake with a jarring lurch, the car skidding on the slick asphalt, the tires losing their grip for a heart-stopping second before catching. The figure was thrown into the stark, unforgiving glare of her headlights, and for a frozen moment, it was a tableau of pure horror. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his expensive-looking black coat was shredded and dark with something far thicker than rainwater. His face was a mask of agony and fury, one hand clamped desperately to his side. From between his fingers, a shocking crimson stream mingled with the rain running down his leg. He wasn't just hurt, he was a sculpture of ruin. Every instinct, every fragment of her nursing training, screamed at her to lock the doors, to hit the gas, to flee from the palpable danger that radiated from him like heat. This was no ordinary victim of a hit-and-run or a random mugging. The raw, predatory intensity in his eyes, even clouded with pain, was a warning written in a primal language. But as he took a staggering step and collapsed against her hood, his head snapping up to meet her gaze through the windshield, another instinct, older and more stubborn, overrode the fear. Here was a human being, bleeding out alone in a storm. Her hands, still trembling from the near accident, found the door handle. The rain immediately soaked through her scrubs, a cold shock that stole her breath. Up close, the damage was worse. A gash on his forehead dripped blood into his eye, and the wound at his side was a deep, ugly thing, likely from a blade, but the way he was favoring his shoulder suggested a gunshot. He tried to speak, his voice a guttural rasp that was swallowed by the wind. "Don't, hospital." His eyes, a startling shade of storm gray, locked onto hers with a terrifying, commanding force. His hand, slick with blood and rain, shot out and gripped her wrist. The strength in that grasp was immense, a final, desperate clenching of life. "Promise me." It was a demand, not a request. In that moment, Liliana stood at a crossroads, the cold rain washing the blood from his hand onto her skin. To leave him was to let a man die. To help him was to invite an unknown, terrifying chaos into her meticulously ordered, fragile world. She looked at his ashen face, the defiant set of his jaw, and made the choice that would unravel everything. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she hauled his heavy, unresponsive form, maneuvering him into the passenger seat of her car. The scent of blood, rain, and faint, expensive cologne filled the small space. As she closed the door on the storm, she had no idea that she wasn't just saving a life, she was pulling the first thread of her own. The drive home was a fever dream painted in the stark, rhythmic strokes of the wiper blades. Every jolt of the car over the rain-swept road drew a sharp, hissed breath from the man slumped against the passenger window, a sound that was both a testament to his pain and a grim reminder of the living, breathing danger she had invited into her sanctuary. The interior of the sedan, once a space filled with the mundane ghosts of fast food wrappers and the faint, clean scent of disinfectant that clung to her scrubs, was now thick with the coppery tang of blood and the oppressive weight of a stranger's suffering. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her mind racing through a frantic triage of his visible injuries while simultaneously screaming at her for her catastrophic lapse in judgment. She had just broken the most fundamental rule of urban survival: never stop for the shadows. Pulling into the narrow, cracked driveway of her modest bungalow felt like docking a ship in a hurricane. The familiar sight of the peeling paint and the overgrown hydrangeas, usually symbols of her financial strain, now seemed like a heartbreakingly fragile bastion of normalcy that she was about to violate. For a terrifying moment, she considered the sleeping form of her brother, Julian, just beyond the front door. Was she bringing a predator to his doorstep? But the man's shallow, ragged breathing from the seat beside her was a biological clock, ticking down to 0. There was no going back. Somehow, with a strength born of pure adrenaline, she managed to half-drag, half-carry his dead weight from the car, through the relentless downpour, and across the threshold of her home. The door clicked shut, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and their combined, labored breathing. He collapsed onto the worn floral rug in her living room, a dark stain of rainwater and blood immediately blooming around him. In the soft, yellow light of the table lamp, he looked both more human and more monstrous. The sharp, aristocratic planes of his face were gaunt with blood loss, his expensive clothes reduced to ruined, clinging rags. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were open and acutely aware, tracking her every movement with a feral intensity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "Kitchen," she instructed, her voice surprisingly steady, the professional nurse usurping the terrified woman. "Top left cupboard. The black case." He didn't move, his gaze holding hers in a silent battle of wills. For a moment, she thought he would refuse, would try to dominate the situation even as his life seeped onto her floor. Then, with a grimace of immense effort, he pushed himself up and shuffled to the small kitchen table, collapsing into a chair with a jarring thud that spoke of a body pushed far beyond its limits. What followed was an hour of tense, intimate warfare. Liliana worked with the methodical efficiency she'd honed in countless bays, laying out her instruments, suture kit, gauze, antiseptic, scissors. But this was different. This wasn't a nameless patient in a controlled, sterile environment. This was a wild animal, cornered and dangerous, in the heart of her home. When she cut away his shirt and coat, the full extent of the damage was laid bare. The gunshot wound was a clean through and through in the meat of his shoulder, but the stab wound below his ribs was deep and angry, the work of someone who knew how to hurt, to maim. As she cleaned the gashes, her fingers slick with his blood, he didn't flinch or cry out. Instead, he watched her, his jaw clenched so tight she feared his teeth would crack. His silence was more unnerving than any scream. The air between them crackled with a perverse energy. Her gentle, clinical touches were a stark contrast to the brutal story his body told. She was acutely aware of the hard muscle beneath her fingertips, the sheer physical power contained in his frame even in its weakened state. He, in turn, seemed to be studying her, memorizing the line of her brow as she concentrated, the way she bit her lip in focus, the simple, unadorned reality of her. It was an invasion, his silent scrutiny feeling more violating than her physical ministrations. When it came time to suture the stab wound, she administered a local anesthetic. As the needle pierced his skin, his hand shot out again, not to stop her, but to anchor himself, his fingers wrapping around her thigh. The contact was electric, a brand of heat through the damp fabric of her scrubs. It was not a gesture of affection or thanks, but one of primal possession, a stark reminder of the power dynamic that had been established the moment she'd stopped her car. He was marking his territory, asserting control in the only way he currently could. Finally, the last bandage was secured, the white gauze a stark contrast against his pale, taut skin. The room was a wreckage of bloodied gauze, empty antiseptic bottles, and the lingering scent of death averted. He leaned back in the chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a profound exhaustion that seemed to age him a decade. His eyes drifted closed for a moment before fluttering open, their intensity undimmed. He looked at the neat, professional work on his torso, then back at her face, his gaze lingering on the smudge of his blood she now realized was on her cheek. "The name is Kale," he rasped, the lie falling from his lips with a practiced ease that sent a fresh chill down her spine. He tried to shift, a flicker of pain twisting his features. "You have a steady hand, nurse." The compliment felt like a threat. He let his head fall back, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that was almost swallowed by the rain, a whisper that was both a promise and a curse, sealing her fate. "You've just earned a favor from a very dangerous man." Then, his body finally surrendered, and he slipped into the deep, troubled sleep of the gravely wounded, leaving Liliana alone in the silence, standing in the wreckage of her old life, his blood drying on her hands. The first gray light of dawn found Liliana exactly where she had been for hours, curled in the worn armchair, her gaze fixed on the sleeping giant at her kitchen table. Sleep had been an impossible concept, a luxury her racing heart and churning thoughts could not afford. The night had stretched into an eternity of small, tense sounds, the ragged cadence of his breathing, the creak of the old house settling, the relentless patter of the rain softening to a drizzle. Every shift of his body, every low groan from a nightmare, had snapped her to attention, her own breath catching in her throat. She was a sentinel guarding a sleeping dragon, terrified of the moment it would awaken. When the sun finally broke, casting weak, watery rays through the rain-streaked window, it illuminated a scene that felt both surreal and disarmingly domestic. The man who called himself Cale was slumped in the ladder-back chair, his head resting on his arms on the table. The bandages she had so carefully applied were stark white against his skin, a testament to the violent night. The evidence of her labor was all around them, the discarded medical wrappers, the bowl of pink-tinged water, the scissors still flecked with dried blood. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of it, mixed with the smell of damp wool and his faint, masculine cologne. It was the smell of a mistake, one she deeply regretted. Then, a car door slammed outside, the sound unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. It was Mrs. Gable from next door, leaving for her early shift. The mundane normality of the sound seemed to break a spell. Cale stirred, his shoulders tensing even before his eyes opened. Liliana watched, frozen, as consciousness returned to him. It wasn't a slow, gentle awakening. It was a swift, calculated reassembly of his persona. His eyes opened, and immediately they were sharp, scanning the room, taking in every detail, the cheap furniture, the family photos on the mantel, her own exhausted form in the chair, before landing on her. There was no disorientation, no gratitude. Only a cold, assessing clarity. Without a word, he pushed himself to his feet, a grimace of pain twisting his handsome features for only a second before it was ruthlessly suppressed. He moved with a stiff, deliberate grace, testing his weight on his injured side. He was a man used to commanding his body through pain. He didn't look at her again. His silence was a wall. He simply walked to the front door, pausing for a moment with his hand on the knob, his broad back to her. He seemed to fill the entire frame, blocking out the morning light. Then, he opened the door and stepped out into the new day, closing it behind him with a soft, definitive click. The relief that washed over Liliana was so profound it left her weak and trembling. It was over. He was gone. She stumbled to the door, locking it with fumbling fingers, then leaned her forehead against the cool wood, her entire body shuddering with the release of tension. She had survived. She had done a good deed, and the universe, in its strange way, had allowed her to walk away unscathed. For the next few hours, she moved through her small house in a daze, cleaning the bloody remnants of the night with a frantic energy, scrubbing away every last trace of him as if she could erase the memory itself. She bundled the ruined rug and the blood-stained towels into a trash bag, her movements sharp and efficient. By the time Julian emerged from his room, yawning and asking about the noise last night, the living room was spotless, the only evidence a faint, lingering scent of antiseptic. She forced a smile, telling him it was just a rough shift, a difficult patient on her mind. The lie felt flimsy, but he accepted it, his own concerns turning to his upcoming doctor's appointment. The rest of the day passed with a strange, suspended quality. She went through the motions, making breakfast for Julian, checking his temperature, trying to focus on the mundane details of their life. But her mind kept drifting back to the storm-gray eyes, the feel of his hand on her thigh, the weight of his body as she dragged him inside. It was only in the late afternoon, as she was changing her sheets, that she found it. Tucked not under the pillow, but wedged with deliberate intent between the mattress and the box spring, was a thick stack of high-denomination bills. There was no note, no explanation. It was a transaction. Payment for services rendered. The sight of the money, so much of it, more than she made in 3 months, did not bring elation. It felt like a condemnation. It was blood money, a final, silent message that reduced her act of mercy to a commercial exchange and severed whatever fragile, terrifying connection they had shared. He had paid his debt and vanished. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of violet and orange, she stood at the kitchen window, watching Julian read on the porch swing. A fragile peace had returned. The terror of the night was receding, becoming a bad dream. She let out a long, slow breath, the tight coil of anxiety in her chest beginning, for the first time in nearly 24 hours, to loosen. He was gone. It was over. They were safe. It was in this exact moment of hard-won relief that the world outside her window went still. The chirping of the evening bird ceased. A profound, unnatural silence descended. Then, with a slow, rolling precision that made her blood run cold, the black sedans began to appear. They didn't speed, they glided, one after another, sliding into place along the curb, blocking the driveway, surrounding her small, vulnerable house with a seamless wall of tinted glass and polished steel. They kept coming, a silent, relentless procession until the street was choked with them. Doors began to open in unison, and 200 men, identically dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits, emerged. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply stood at attention, their impassive faces turned toward her home, turning the familiar suburban street into a military formation. The fragile peace shattered into a million pieces. He wasn't gone. He had just gone to get his army. The world had shrunk to the square of her windowpane, a frame filled with a silent, motionless army. Liliana stood paralyzed, her hand frozen on the lace curtain she had just drawn aside. The tremors started deep within her core, a seismic vibration of pure terror that threatened to buckle her knees. This was not a bad dream, this was the waking nightmare that the previous night had only hinted at. The man, Cale, had not simply left. He had reconnoitered, assessed her vulnerability, and returned with a force so absolute it rendered the very concept of resistance laughable. The 200 figures were not just men, they were a wall, a statement, a physical manifestation of a power so vast it could afford to be patient, could afford to be silent. Their stillness was more threatening than any shouted demand. Behind her, she heard the soft shuffle of Julian's slippers. "Lily? What's all that?" His voice, thin with confusion and the ever-present undercurrent of his illness, was a shard of glass in the tense silence. She dropped the curtain as if it were on fire, spinning around to block his view, forcing a calm she was galaxies from feeling onto her face. "It's nothing, Jules. Probably a city work crew. Or a film shoot." The lies were ash in her mouth. "Go back to your book. I'll handle it." She gently maneuvered him toward his bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The doorbell chimed, a single, polite note that was somehow more terrifying than a battering ram. It was the sound of inevitability. Smoothing her rumpled shirt with damp palms, she walked to the front door, each step feeling like a march to the gallows. She turned the knob, the click echoing in the tomb-like quiet of her home. On her porch stood a single man, distinct from the faceless legion behind him. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples and a face that was both severe and strangely composed. He was dressed in a suit of charcoal gray, impeccably tailored, and he held his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He was the picture of civility, a wolf in a banker's clothing. "Miss," he began, his voice a low, cultured baritone that held no warmth but also no overt threat. It was the voice of a man stating simple, unchangeable facts. "My name is Silas. I represent Don Vargo." The name meant nothing to her, but the title, Don, sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. It confirmed her darkest suspicions. "He requires your continued services as his private physician. His recovery must be absolute, and he finds your work satisfactory." Liliana found her voice, a thin, reedy thing. "He left. I was paid. The transaction is complete." She gestured weakly toward the street. This is unnecessary." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Silas's lips, not of humor, but of pity for her naivete. "The money was a gesture of goodwill, for your initial discretion and skill. What Don Vargo requires now is your undivided attention. This is not a negotiation of terms, but an arrangement of logistics." His eyes, a cool, assessing blue, moved past her, taking in the modest interior of her home. "You will gather what you need. You will be provided with everything else." Panic, sharp and acrid, rose in her throat. "I can't. My brother, he's ill. He needs me. I can't leave him." The words tumbled out, a desperate plea. Silas's gaze returned to hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something calculating, a reassessment. He unclasped his hands and slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket. The movement was so controlled, so deliberate, that she flinched, half expecting a weapon. Instead, he produced a sleek, black phone. He didn't dial, he merely pressed a single button and held it to his ear, his eyes never leaving hers. "The nurse has a dependent," he said into the phone, his tone respectful, deferential. "A younger brother. In frail health." He listened for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Understood." He lowered the phone. "The terms are amended. Your brother will accompany you. His care will also be insured. This is a generous offer, Mississippi. It would be unwise to look for a better one." The amendment was not a concession, it was a deeper, more insidious trap. They weren't just taking her, they were taking Julian, making him a part of this, using him as the ultimate leverage. To refuse was to condemn them both to an unknown, but certainly violent, fate. To accept was to walk willingly into a gilded cage, with her brother's well-being as the lock. She looked past Silas at the sea of impassive faces, at the impenetrable line of vehicles. There was no running. There was no hiding. The man from the storm had not just returned, he had laid claim to her entire world. Her shoulders slumped, the last of her defiance leaching away, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. She was a nurse, a healer, and she had just been conscripted into the service of a king. "Give me 10 minutes, she whispered, the sound barely audible. "To pack his medicines." Silas gave a single, slow nod. 10 minutes. He didn't move from the doorway, a silent sentinel ensuring her compliance. Liliana turned and walked back into the heart of her home, the familiar space now feeling like a stage she was about to exit forever. She was no longer Liliana, the sister, the nurse. She was Liliana, the property of Kaelin Vargo. The journey to the Vargo estate was a silent, funereal procession through a city that no longer felt like her own. Seated in the plush, sound-deadened interior of a sedan, with Julian pressed anxiously against her side, Liliana watched the familiar urban landscape dissolve into sprawling, manicured suburbs, which then gave way to guarded gates and winding, private roads that climbed into wooded seclusion. The world outside the tinted windows grew more opulent and more isolated with every turn, a physical representation of the power that had ensnared them. Julian, pale and wide-eyed, asked no questions, his hand clutching hers with a fear that mirrored her own. He was intelligent enough to understand that city work crews did not travel in convoys of armored cars. When the car finally slowed, it was not before a house, but before a fortress masquerading as one. The structure was a masterpiece of modern austerity and old-world strength, all sharp angles, vast sheets of glass, and weathered stone, nestled into the crest of a hill like a predator surveying its domain. High walls, discreetly integrated into the landscape, hinted at a perimeter that was more than decorative. The lead car paused at a massive, wrought-iron gate, which swung open without a sound, admitting them into a courtyard that was a study in controlled, minimalist beauty. There were no cheerful flower beds here, only sculpted evergreens and a reflecting pool so still it looked like a sheet of obsidian. Silas opened their door, his presence a constant, chilling reminder of their new reality. "Your brother will be shown to his quarters. You will come with me." It was not a suggestion. She squeezed Julian's hand, a silent promise she had no power to keep, before allowing herself to be led away, her nurse's bag feeling absurdly small and insignificant in her hand. The interior of the estate was cavernous, a symphony of polished concrete, dark wood, and priceless art. Their footsteps echoed in the vast, open spaces, the air cool and still, smelling of lemon polish and something else, an ozone-clean scent of absolute control. It was a world devoid of clutter, of mess, of life as she knew it. Silas stopped before a pair of heavy, dark wood doors. He opened one without knocking and gestured for her to enter. The room beyond was not a bedroom, it was a command center. One entire wall was glass, offering a panoramic, terrifyingly beautiful view of the city they had just left behind, now laid out like a glittering map of a world she could no longer access. And in the center of the room, propped up by a mountain of pillows on a vast platform of a bed, was Kaelin Vargo. He looked different in the clear, unforgiving light of day that streamed through the windows. The pallor of blood loss was still there, but it was overshadowed by an aura of sheer, untouchable authority. He wore a simple black silk shirt, unbuttoned at the throat, the fine fabric doing little to conceal the bulk of his bandaged shoulder or the powerful frame beneath. The man from her kitchen table, vulnerable, bleeding, dependent, was gone. In his place was the dawn. His storm-gray eyes, no longer clouded with pain, swept over her from head to toe, taking in her cheap shoes, her simple trousers, the fear she was desperately trying to suppress. There was no recognition, no gratitude, only a cold, analytical assessment. "Your patient awaits, miss," Silas said from the doorway, before closing the door, leaving her alone with him. The click of the latch was the sound of her cage being locked. "Begin," Kalen said, his voice a low command that vibrated through the spacious room. He made no move to facilitate her, simply watching as she approached the bed, her every step feeling clumsy and exposed. The intimate act of caregiving was now a performance under a harsh, unblinking spotlight. Her hands, which had been so steady in the chaos of her own kitchen, now trembled slightly as she unpacked her supplies. The familiar rituals, checking his temperature, his pulse, examining the wounds, were stripped of their clinical detachment. Each touch was scrutinized. When she peeled back the bandage on his side, her fingers brushing against the warm, hard plane of his stomach, his gaze was so intense she felt it like a physical weight. "The flesh knits well," he observed, his tone that of a man discussing a repaired vehicle. "You are as competent as I remembered." Liliana focused on applying a fresh dressing, her eyes fixed on the white gauze. "It's my job." "Is it?" he countered, his voice dropping, becoming almost conversational, which was somehow more threatening. "Or is it your nature? To patch up broken things you find in the dark?" He shifted slightly, a deliberate movement that brought him closer, invading her space. The scent of him, clean linen, antiseptic, and that underlying, dangerous masculinity, enveloped her. "Tell me, do you feel like a nurse now? Or a prisoner?" The question hung in the air, stark and undeniable. She finished her task and began to repack her bag, her movements hurried, desperate for an escape. "I feel like I'm doing what I must to protect my brother." A slow, dark smile touched his lips, a crack in the marble facade that revealed something predatory beneath. "Good," he purred. "Then we have an understanding. Your cooperation ensures his comfort. Your skills ensure my recovery. It is a simple, elegant arrangement." He leaned back against the pillows, his eyes never leaving her. "You are dismissed. For now. Silas will show you to your room. It adjoins your brother's. You will return in 6 hours to re-evaluate the wounds." Liliana turned and walked toward the door, her spine rigid. She could feel his gaze on her back every step of the way, a brand that marked her as his. She had entered the lion's den not as a tamer, but as live prey that had been granted a temporary, conditional reprieve. The gilded cage was not just the estate, it was the role she had been forced to play, a captive caregiver tending to the most dangerous man she had ever met. The days within the Vargo estate began to assume a grim, predictable rhythm, a parody of a normal life played out under a microscope. Liliana and Julian were given a suite of rooms that were the height of luxury, a sitting area with a breathtaking, terrifying view, 2 lavish bedrooms, and a marble bathroom larger than her entire kitchen at home. It was a prison designed by a master architect, where every comfort was a reminder of the power that provided it, and every door that wasn't explicitly locked felt like a test. Julian, after the initial shock, had retreated into a shell of quiet observation. He spent hours reading books from the estate's extensive library or working on complex puzzles Silas had provided, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. He rarely spoke of their situation, but the worried glances he cast her way when she returned from her sessions with Kalen were a constant, silent commentary. It was during one of these returns, the scent of antiseptic and Kalen's cologne still clinging to her clothes, that the pristine silence of the estate was fractured. A raised voice, hard and laced with a venomous anger, echoed from the direction of Kalen's study. Liliana froze, her hand on her doorknob. Curiosity, that most dangerous of instincts, pricked at her. She gestured for Julian to stay in his room and moved silently down the hall, pressing herself into the shadowed alcove near the half-opened study door. The voice was not Kalen's, it was younger, brasher, fueled by a sense of grievance. "You're moving too cautiously, Kalen. The Morelli family is weak. Their old man is on his deathbed, and his sons are squabbling like children. We have a clear shot, and you're sitting in your bedroom playing invalid." The unseen speaker practically spat the last word. Kalen's response, when it came, was a low, controlled rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. It held none of the other man's heat, only an absolute, chilling authority. The Morellis are a cornered animal, Marco. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous. They expect a frontal assault. They do not expect their supply lines to be severed, their allies to be bought, and their reputation to be turned to ash before the first shot is ever fired. There was a soft, rhythmic sound, the tap of a finger on hardwood. Patience is not a weakness. It is a weapon you are too impulsive to wield. A scoff. Patience? Is that what you call it? I call it fear. The men are talking. They say you've gone soft. The rhythmic tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more threatening, than the shouted words had been. The men, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow perfectly clear, should be very careful about what they say, and to whom. And you, cousin, should remember who pulled you from the gutter and gave you a name. Your ambition is noted. Do not let it outgrow your usefulness. There was no further argument, only the sound of a chair scraping back and hurried, retreating footsteps. Liliana shrank deeper into the shadows as a young, dark-haired man with a face contorted in fury stormed past, never seeing her. She stood there for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just been given a glimpse behind the curtain, into the brutal, Darwinian politics of this world. It was a nest of vipers, and Kalen was the king serpent, calmly dealing with a challenger not with brute force, but with psychological evisceration. The threat had been neutralized with words, but the promise of violence had hung in the air, palpable and sharp. Later that evening, as she sat with Julian in their sitting room, he looked up from his book, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "He's the one, isn't he?" he asked, his voice quiet. "The man from the storm. Kalen Vargo." Liliana's breath hitched. She had never spoken the name in front of him. She simply nodded, a slow, weary gesture. Julian closed his book, his thin fingers tracing its embossed cover. "I've been reading the Financial Times on the tablet Silas gave me. The business sections. The Vargo holdings are mentioned a lot. They're powerful. But the articles, they have a certain way of phrasing things. Unexplained market shifts. Competitors who suddenly retire." He met her gaze, his eyes old beyond his years. "He's not just a businessman, Lily. He's the center of a very dark galaxy. And we're now trapped in his orbit." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "You have to be more careful than you've ever been. Don't trust anyone. Not the quiet one, Silas. Certainly not him. Please. Just be a shadow. Do your job and be a shadow." His warning settled over her, colder and more frightening than Kalen's direct threats. Her brother, the scholar, had pieced together the truth from the dry prose of business journalism and the charged atmosphere of this house. He saw the web they were caught in with a clarity that terrified her. Nodding again, she reached out and squeezed his hand, a silent vow. She would be careful. She would be a shadow. But as she sat in the opulent silence, the echo of Kalen's voice dealing with his cousin played in her mind. In this world, even shadows could be found and consumed. The summons came late, long after the estate had fallen into a deep, watchful silence. The digital clock on her bedside table glowed 2:17 a.m. when a soft, insistent knock sounded on her door. It was Silas, his expression as unreadable as ever, informing her that Don Vargo was experiencing discomfort and required her assistance. The request was a formality, the command beneath it was absolute. Pulling a robe over her nightdress, Liliana followed him through the darkened corridors, the plush carpet swallowing their footsteps, the only light coming from discreet, recessed fixtures that illuminated their path like a runway to damnation. Kalen's room was bathed in the cool, monochromatic light of the moon, which streamed through the massive windows, painting everything in shades of silver and charcoal. He was not in bed, but standing before the glass, a solitary silhouette against the sprawling tapestry of the city's nightlights. He held a glass of amber liquor in one hand, the other pressed gently against his bandaged side. He didn't turn as she entered, dismissing Silas with a slight gesture of his head. The door clicked shut, leaving them in the vast, intimate silence. "The wound," he stated, his back still to her. "It burns." It was her cue to begin, to perform her duties in silence and retreat. But something in her, worn thin by days of fear and the cloying oppression of her gilded cage, snapped. The carefully constructed wall of professional detachment crumbled. "Of course it burns," she said, her voice sharper than she intended, cutting through the quiet. "You were stabbed. You should be resting, not holding court in the dead of night." Slowly, he turned. In the moonlight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, his gray eyes gleaming with a dangerous amusement. "Holding court? Is that what you think I do?" "It's what I know you do," she retorted, stepping forward, the fear morphing into a reckless anger. "I heard your discussion today. With your cousin. Is this how your world works? Threats and posturing? It's a sickness." He took a slow sip of his drink, watching her over the rim of the glass. "My world," he countered, his voice deceptively soft, "is a reflection of the one you live in, just without the pretty lies. You think the hospital where you work is any different? It's a hierarchy of power, a struggle for resources, a place where life and death decisions are made every day. The only difference is the scale and the honesty of the violence." He took a step toward her. "Your morality, nurse, is a luxury. A privilege afforded to those who have never had to fight for the very air in their lungs." "It's not a luxury, it's a choice," she fired back, her hands clenching at her sides. "You choose to be a monster. You choose this darkness." He was in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the flecks of silver in his irises. The air crackled, thick with a tension that had been building since the moment she'd pulled him from the rain. "A monster," he repeated, the word a low caress. "You called me that in your kitchen, with your gentle hand stitching me back together. You patch up the monster and then condemn him for the teeth he uses to survive." His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. "You have no idea what forged this monster. You have no concept of the betrayal that strips a man down to his most essential, brutal parts." The anger in his voice was no longer directed at her, but at a memory, a ghost. For the first time, the impeccable armor of the Don showed a hairline fracture. "I was 17, he said, the words ripped from a place deep within him. "My father's most trusted friend, a man who had eaten at our table, who had held me on his knee, put a bullet in my father's head to take his seat. He then handed my mother over to his men to secure their loyalty." The flat, horrific delivery was more powerful than any shout. "There is no morality in that world, Liliana. There is only power, and the will to wield it. Everything else is a weakness to be exploited." In that moment, the image of the ruthless Don shattered, and she saw not a monster, but a boy, brutalized and forged in a crucible of unimaginable treachery. The righteous anger drained from her, replaced by a devastating, unwanted pang of empathy. He was a product of his world, just as she was of hers. The line between captor and caregiver, between monster and man, blurred into a painful, confusing gray. He saw the shift in her eyes, the understanding that replaced the condemnation. A muscle feathered in his jaw. Without a word, he reached out, his fingers not gripping, but gently tracing the line of her jaw, a touch so at odds with his every previous action that it stole her breath. It was an acknowledgement, a connection forged in shared, albeit vastly different, pain. Then, he leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of tenderness, but of raw, desperate claiming. A collision of two worlds, the healing and the wounded, the light and the dark. It was a taste of power and vulnerability, of control surrendered and seized. And for one terrifying, exhilarating heartbeat, Liliana did not pull away. She kissed him back, lost in the storm, the line between them dissolving completely in the moonlit silence. The kiss became a fault line, fracturing the fragile reality Liliana had constructed within the estate's walls. In the days that followed, a new, more dangerous tension simmered between her and Kalen, a silent, charged current that hummed beneath the surface of their clinical interactions. When she changed his dressings, her hands no longer trembled with simple fear, but with a bewildering cocktail of apprehension and a treacherous, unwelcome thrill. His gaze, which had once felt like an interrogation, now felt like a physical caress, stripping away her professional detachment layer by layer. He said nothing of the incident, but his silence was more eloquent than any words, a shared secret that bound them tighter than any lock or threat ever could. The gilded cage no longer felt like just a prison, it had become a labyrinth, and she was hopelessly, dangerously lost within it. The change in the estate's atmosphere was as subtle and as undeniable as a shift in barometric pressure before a hurricane. Silas, ever observant, seemed to move with an even quieter efficiency, his blue eyes missing nothing. Julian watched her with a deepening concern, the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. She avoided his gaze, ashamed of the confusion that churned inside her. How could she explain the pull she felt toward the man who held them captive? It was a betrayal of herself, of her brother, of every principle she had ever held. The storm broke on a rain-lashed night, eerily reminiscent of the one that had started it all. Liliana was in her room, trying to read, when the first sound, out of place and violently wrong, reached her, a distant, muffled crack, followed by the shattering of glass. She froze, the book slipping from her nerveless fingers. For a moment, there was silence, then chaos erupted. Alarms blared, a strident, electronic shriek that tore through the peaceful veneer of the estate. Shouted orders, the sound of running feet, and then, the unmistakable, percussive pop of gunfire, close and getting closer. Her door flew open. Kalen stood there, his face a mask of cold fury, a sleek, black pistol held effortlessly in his hand. He was no longer the convalescing patient, he was a warrior king defending his fortress. "Stay here. Lock the door," he commanded, his voice cutting through the din. But as he turned to leave, a figure clad in black tactical gear burst into the hallway from a side passage, his weapon raised. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to that single, horrifying moment. Liliana saw the intruder's finger tighten on the trigger, the barrel aimed directly at Kalen's back. A scream lodged in her throat. Kalen, moving with a predator's instinct, spun around. But he was too slow, his injured side compromising his fluidity. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The bullet meant for his heart tore through his already wounded shoulder. He roared in pain and fury, but his own weapon never wavered. He fired twice, two precise, devastating shots that struck the man's center mass, throwing him back against the wall where he slid to the floor, leaving a thick, dark smear on the pale paint. The hallway fell silent, the immediate threat neutralized. The acrid smell of cordite filled the air, mixing with the coppery scent of fresh blood. Kalen stood panting, his good hand clamped over the new, bleeding wound in his shoulder, his eyes wild with adrenaline and pain. He turned his head, his gaze finding Liliana, who stood paralyzed in the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth. He had just killed a man. He had ended a life with brutal, dispassionate efficiency right in front of her. The violence wasn't an abstract concept anymore, it was a visceral, bloody reality, splattered across the walls and seared onto her retinas. His men swarmed the corridor, securing the area. Silas appeared, his expression grim as he assessed the situation. Kalen never took his eyes off Liliana. As two of his men moved to help him, he shook them off, stumbling toward her instead. He stopped mere inches away, his blood-slicked hand reaching out to grasp her arm, his grip like a vice. His face was pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his voice was low, flat, and utterly final. "You see," he rasped, his eyes boring into hers, demanding her understanding, her submission. "This is the world. This is the reality you are a part of now. You saw him die. You know my face. You know the extent of the threat against me." He leaned in closer, the scent of gunpowder and his own blood overwhelming her senses. "There is no walking away from this, Liliana. There is no going back to your quiet life. You are in it. You belong to this now. You belong to me." The words were not a romantic declaration, they were a sentence. The kiss in the moonlight had been a moment of blurred lines, but this, the blood, the death, the cold, hard claim in his eyes, was a brutal reaffirmation of the truth. He had protected her, but in doing so, he had ensured her permanent captivity. The fragile connection they had shared was now sealed in blood, and the door to her old life slammed shut forever. The aftermath of the attack was a quiet, seething thing. The body was removed, the blood scrubbed from the walls with an efficiency that spoke of grim routine, the shattered window boarded up. But the violence had left an indelible stain on the air, a psychic scar that everyone in the estate carried. For Liliana, the shock was a cold, clarifying bath. The man bleeding on her rug, the silent army at her door. The kiss in the moonlight, they had all been abstractions, terrifying but somehow contained. Watching a life extinguished before her eyes, seeing the casual, brutal proficiency with which Kalen meted out death, had shattered the last of her illusions. This was not a dark fairy tale, it was a war, and she was standing in the middle of the battlefield. In the days that followed, a profound shift occurred within her. The trembling fear that had been her constant companion began to harden, calcifying into a core of cold, sharp resolve. Kaylin's words echoed in her mind, not as a threat, but as a challenge. You belong to this now, very well. If she belonged to it, she would no longer be its passive victim. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also a nurse, a strategist of the human body, and she had just been given a front-row seat to the weaknesses of her enemy's enemy. During her next session with Kaylin, as she cleaned the new, angry wound in his shoulder, a painful but ultimately superficial graze, he was holding a tense, quiet meeting with Silas and two other high-ranking captains. They were discussing the Morelli family, the architects of the failed attack, their strategy relying on brute force and retaliation. "We hit their docks tonight," one of the captains, a man with a scarred lip, growled. "Burn the shipments. Send a message." Kaylin listened, his expression giving nothing away, but Liliana saw the slight tension around his eyes. It was a strain, a physical toll the plan was taking. She finished taping the fresh gauze in place, her movements slow and deliberate. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when she spoke, was unervingly calm. That would be a mistake. The room went utterly silent. All four men turned to look at her, the captains with expressions of pure incredulity, Silas with guarded curiosity, and Kaylin with a slow, burning intensity. "The nurse should not speak of things she doesn't understand," the scarred captain sneered. Liliana met his gaze, then turned her eyes to Kaylin. "The man who attacked the hallway. And the two others your men treated for minor injuries in the West Wing." She paused, ensuring she had his full attention. They all had the same thing. A residue on their hands and under their fingernails. A specific, industrial-grade adhesive, mixed with a particular polymer dust. It's used in the automotive industry. For assembling high-end, soundproofed interiors. Kaylin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain." "You said the Morellis were a cornered animal," she continued, her clinical tone a stark contrast to the subject matter. "Cornered animals don't just lash out, they protect their den. If their men are working with those materials, it's not their docks that are the priority. It's their new, hidden vehicle depot. The one they're using for their own counterstrikes. It's likely underground, probably in the old industrial district near the river, where the sound wouldn't be noticed. Burning their shipments at the docks is what they expect. It's a diversion. If you find the depot, you don't just burn their goods, you destroy their mobility. You paralyze them." The silence that followed was profound. She had taken the raw, clinical data she had unconsciously absorbed, the forensics of violence left on the bodies of the attackers, and synthesized it into a tactical advantage. She wasn't thinking like a soldier, she was thinking like a diagnostician, finding the illness and proposing the cure. Kaylin stared at her for a long, long moment, his stormy gaze stripping her bare, seeing past the nurse, past the captive, to the sharp, analytical mind that had been hidden beneath. A slow, dark smile, one of genuine, predatory appreciation, spread across his face. It was the look a king gives upon discovering a hitherto unknown and invaluable weapon. "Silas," he said, his voice low and decisive, never breaking eye contact with her. "Scrap the dock plans. Redirect all intelligence to the old industrial district. I want that depot found by morning." As the men filed out, a new respect in their glances toward her, Kaylin reached out, his fingers gently closing around her wrist. It was not the grip of a captor, but of a partner. "It seems I acquired more than just a nurse in that storm," he murmured, his thumb stroking the delicate skin of her inner wrist. He leaned in, and this time, the kiss was different. It was not a claiming born of desperate passion, but a seal. A recognition of a dangerous new alliance forged in blood and cunning. She did not pull away. She met his intensity with her own, a silent acknowledgement of the pact she had just made. To survive, to protect Julian, she had to stop being the healed and become the weapon. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the fire, and in Kaylin Vargo's eyes, she saw her own reflection, forever changed. The paralysis of the Morelli family was not merely a victory, it was an extermination. The intelligence Liliana provided, born from a nurse's observant eye and a mind forced to sharpen into a blade, proved devastatingly accurate. The hidden depot was not just found, it was annihilated. Kaylin's retaliation was a masterpiece of overwhelming, precise force, a lesson written in fire and steel that echoed through the underworld. The Vargo name, once respected and feared, was now spoken in a hushed, reverent terror. In the wake of the carnage, a new, unshakable order settled over the city, its foundation stone laid not just by Kalen's ruthlessness, but by the unexpected cunning of the woman at his side. Weeks bled into a month, and the estate, once her gilded cage, transformed into the seat of a shared power. Liliana no longer occupied the guest suite. She was given her own chambers, adjacent to Kalen's, a space of equal opulence and security. Julian, seeing the unspoken shift in the dynamics, the new, hardened light in his sister's eyes, and the deferential way even Silas now addressed her, found his fear slowly replaced by a complex, wary acceptance. His world, too, had been remade, but it was stable, his health meticulously managed by the best specialists Kalen's money and influence could quietly procure. The threat was not gone, but it had been pushed back beyond the walls, a distant storm they had weathered together. On the evening marking the full moon since the attack, Kalen summoned her to his study. He stood before the same window where he had once dissected his cousin's ambition, but now he was the picture of restored, formidable health. The sling was gone, the bandages discarded. He wore his power as easily as the exquisitely tailored suit that hugged his broad shoulders. The city lights sprawled before him, a kingdom he now held more completely than ever. He turned as she entered, his gaze, once coldly analytical, now held a possessive, simmering heat that acknowledged the partner she had become. "The Morelli concern is concluded," he stated, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Their assets are absorbed. Their name is Ash." He paused, letting the finality of the statement hang in the air. "A new structure is required. One that accounts for new realities." He moved to his desk, a massive piece of carved obsidian, and picked up a long, narrow box of polished black velvet. It was not the size or shape of a jewelry box. He held it out to her, not as an offering, but as a presentation. "A king rewards his loyal soldiers," he said. "But a partner, a queen, requires something different." Liliana took the box, its cool, weighty solidity feeling ominous in her hands. She lifted the lid. Nestled inside on a bed of black silk was not a ring, not a necklace, but a dagger. It was a work of deadly art, its blade sleek and forged from darkened steel that seemed to drink the light, its hilt wrapped in black leather, crowned with a single, deep blue sapphire that echoed the storm in his eyes. It was beautiful, elegant, and utterly lethal. "A ring is a symbol of possession," Kalen explained, his voice dropping to an intimate timbre as he stepped closer, his presence enveloping her. "A crown is a target. But a weapon." He reached into the box, his fingers brushing against hers as he lifted the dagger, placing its cool, sharp weight into her palm. It was perfectly balanced, a natural extension of her arm. "A weapon is a promise. A promise that you will never again be a victim. That you will never be defenseless. That your safety, and the safety of those you love, rests in your own capable hands." His fingers closed over hers on the hilt, his grip firm and warm. "A queen," he whispered, his breath ghosting across her cheek, "should never be without her own defense." Liliana looked from the deadly, beautiful object in her hand to the man who had given it to her. She saw not the monster from the storm, nor the captor who had surrounded her home, but the man whose wounds she had healed and whose world she had helped conquer. He had not offered her freedom, because the woman she had been was gone. That naive, compassionate nurse had been reshaped, her soul tempered in the fires of violence and dark alliance. She had bandaged his wounds, and in return, he had forged her into something stronger, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. They were bound now, not by force, but by a bond of blood, understanding, and a shared, terrifying power. She curled her fingers tightly around the hilt of the dagger, her gaze meeting his with a matching, unflinching strength. She was his, and he was hers, and the world would learn to fear them both. Their story of dark passion and ruthless power has only just begun. To ensure you don't miss the next chapter of Liliana and Kalen's gripping saga, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications, and let us know in the comments what you think awaits them in the shadows of their reign.